Greetings and welcome. We are in 303, and our objective now for the hour is to address this issue of Republic 7 and the Cave Allegory from the perspective of implication. So I would write that in our notes, and now we're ready to go to work with it. That is to say the following. You have a really kind of strange story that's told in Republic 7 about a group of people who are sitting in a cave chained up. They're unable to see behind them and the fire that's behind them and the walk path that's behind them. They look at shadows on a wall and assume about those shadows that they're real. From outside of the caves comes some kind of pedagogue, deliverer, instructor, educator, teacher, who then comes into the cave, emancipates, frees, and that's a key word. I would already be writing that word freedom and free down. Frees a young person, turns the young person around, shows the young person the fire. The young person, ironically, is not interested in any more information. The young person is dragged out of the cave, kicking and screaming by the hair, is often the translation. Fear and pain involved in that project of coming into the light. Yes, the educational process. Out into the light he comes. Of course, he has problems seeing for a while. Finally, his vision will grow accustomed to the light, and more particularly the awareness that will be what we will call knowledge. Finally, that same individual will then return back into the cave. Remember our opening lines of Republic 1, I went down to the Piraeus. So you can already see how Plato is setting us up in the opening lines of Republic 1 for this kind of idea. The return back into the cave of the enlightened individual or instructor, however you wish to think of it, who then goes back in but then is rejected, is ridiculed, is made fun of, not really able, those in the cave, to completely comprehend or understand what it is that is the project of education, and yet the recycling of the project again. Now the question, of course, is, out of this strange little story, we then will have the answer to the myth of Gyges / the myth of Maverick as we've presented in an earlier lecture, right? That is to say, when money falls on the floor and you're working Maverick, why is it that you are capable of giving the money back every time without any threat of afterlife or in this life punishment or some kind of promise of reward that would come from some exterior source? And the answer for Plato is quite simply, once one comes to a certain kind of understanding about what is real versus what is perceived to be real, the distinction here sometimes epistemologically is what one knows versus what one believes, right? What one understands to be true versus what one thinks to be true. These are all kind of parts of the same, right? This is one way to look at the myth of Maverick being answered in the Cave Allegory. Now what we want to do is ask a couple of more questions about the implications. So let's go to work with it. One of the word pictures that I've used in the past is one that looks like this. Imagine for a moment that wall there, I just turn and I look at it for some bizarre reason, and this would not shock one or two of you because this is a strange man anyway, and I just turn and run as hard as I can at the wall. I just run right into it. Imagine this in your mind's eye. I just, right into the wall I go. I fall down, okay, I get up, I scream at the wall. And then I back up even further and take another run at the wall. I hit it, now my nose is bleeding, maybe part of my body is broken. I get up, I'm screaming obscenities at the wall, and I back up even further, right? And I'm ready to go at the wall one more time when one of you just kind of whispers, hey, dude, there's a thing called a door, and you open it. You can go out the door if your objective is to get on the other side of this wall. Now, as bizarre and as sophomoric as my little word picture is, two comments. One or two of us have to admit that once or twice in our life, this little project of running into the wall over and over and over, and the only thing we did differenter was to back up further from the wall, thinking that somehow if we ran at it harder, there was at least what we'll call, for lack of a better term, a moral victory involved. Well, at least I hit it harder than the last, and then back up, and I'm going to do it hard. You know what I'm saying? And after a while, we kind of start to say to ourselves the penultimate question, why am I doing this over and over again? Kind of a word picture for some of us of maybe life choices. The second observation is more intriguing. The door has been suggested as an alternative, but not required. You can continue to run into the wall for the rest of your life. You don't have to choose the door just because it's been shown to you. It requires a certain element of faith to believe that the door is somehow different from running into the wall. And for some of us, we'll continue the word picture to say, maybe we really don't want to be on the other side of the wall, which is why we keep running into the wall. The door takes us out of the room and into the hall, which is, of course, a bit unknown. Sartre's great play, No Exit, comes to mind. When that room is found to have a door that is unlocked, which leads to a long hall, dark, yes, unknown, absolutely. The question is, which is better? To stay in the room that you know and keep running against the wall, that is to say, to stay in the cave, or to actually leave the cave. And in the process of leaving the cave, no question, transformation then is possible. But remember, the fear and pain is of a particular kind, not self-chosen. At least not in Plato's word picture. Let's talk about what this word picture of the cave allegory could maybe mean, and has meant for a number of readers over the years. One is to simply point out that this is a word picture about two things, same thing, but two words. One we're going to say understanding, and the other is going to be freedom. Now, if you'll think about it, we begin with people sitting in a cave who are chained up. In other words, they are not free. Okay? So the challenge of this word picture is for Plato to say, how much do you want to be free? Note the irony. When the young boy initially is freed or emancipated, and he's turned around and shown the fire behind, he doesn't jump up and down and go, yippee, show me more. Right? In other words, he does not realize the value of freedom. He has assumed all his life that he kind of was maybe free, looking at shadows on a wall. He did not maybe completely understand the very concept of freedom because he didn't actually comprehend the idea of understanding. Notice that Plato will say in Apology that the thing that makes him so wise is that he recognizes he doesn't know anything. To know that you don't know. We're speaking here, of course, of metacognition, aren't we? To know that you don't know is a huge step forward towards this understanding. Now, there's kind of two understandings, if you read this kind of word picture well, that come to mind. So let's list both of them. The first we're going to talk about from the psychological perspective. The second we're going to talk about from the sociological perspective. That is to say, first, we're going to talk about understanding of the individual, what we will call perspicacity. The second will be understanding of others. All right? And while we don't have to necessarily read it in that order, it probably makes sense to see it in that order. Okay? In other words, we can think about freeing ourselves and then worry about the freedom of others, I guess is a way to think of it. Let's outline both quickly. The first we'll call self-understanding. Our word here is several words. Insight as opposed to outsight. Does that make sense? Right? If we were to ask what is the difference between outsight and insight, of course we're talking about here, insight equals perspicacity. The ability to know who you are. Remember the Delphi Oracle, know thyself, right? In other words, the unexamined life is not worth living. What does it mean, unexamined life? Well, from the Cave Allegory, it is the idea that one is finally going to go in quest of freedom, emancipation, to escape the cave. Okay? One way to think about this is, of course, you're as free as you allow yourself to be. And another way I like to think about this is the questions that we ask. If Socrates does anything for us in the Socratic method of his questioning, he challenges us to analyze the kind of questions that we ask. Are you ready for this? The theodictic question, why do bad things happen when bad things happen? What is the primary question? So, for example, go back in your own life and ask, the last time something really bad happened to you. Your implications were to ask the question, why is this happening to me? The Cave Allegory will suggest, and of course Plato is making a very fine point in other dialogues as well, that when read in concert, all of these dialogues seem to be suggesting the following. The question that you ask when bad things happen is the key to freedom. To ask, why did this happen to me, isn't an unanswerable question. Because every answer that can be appropriated will always follow up with another follow-up question, like, well, why did that have to happen to me? Or, and by extension, to others. Plato will suggest in the Cave Allegory that to change that little word to the word for is the beginnings of perspicacity. What he will call wisdom. Okay, he uses the term wisdom. Namely, why did this happen for me? Now think about the distinction here in regards to those sitting in the cave. To ask, why did this happen to me, posits an individual where the universe is somehow conspiring against this individual, almost like a victim. These things are happening to me and there's nothing I can do about them. To change the preposition from to to for allows for us to begin to take control of the way we understand the things that happen in our life. Notice this doesn't alter the events necessarily that are happening in our life, but rather, what's the point of them? When we ask, why did this happen for us, we are capable of having some ownership. That is to say, freedom. When we can actually answer the question for ourselves, why did this happen for me? It's not that we are celebrating somehow, yippee, bad things happen, I'm so happy they happen. No. But rather we're capable of saying, there has got to be some lesson, some propedeutic in the pain, in the fear. What have I learned in the process? Of course, when we're talking with ball players, we always then talk about losses are always some way to learn something, right? Even if it's painful. You still can appropriate learning in spite of the failure or the loss. Of course, when we talk about the loss of individuals, this immediately comes to mind, doesn't it? So we lose people who are close to us, either quite literally in the form of death or emotionally, maybe in breakups or whatever. We can always go back to a time in our life when we lost somebody, either literally or metaphorically, and we were in tremendous pain. And the obvious question we wanted to ask is, why did this happen to me? And Plato will say, that's an unanswerable question. But if we can learn, and that's a key word in the educative process, if we can learn to ask, why did this happen for me, we can begin to have control over our own life. That's called freedom. That is to say, you're as free as you allow yourself to be. Another way to say this is, you're as free as you allow yourself to ask the question, why did this happen for me? Now, learning to ask the question, why did this happen for me, is no easy project. Go back again to the last time you were in tremendous pain. The last thing you wanted to hear from anybody was, honey, this is good for you. See, nobody really wants to hear that when they're in the midst of tremendous pain. Again, fear and pain are the two core elements of Plato's pedagogy, because it's only through addressing fear and pain that one can finally come to this question, why did this happen for me? I mean, we naturally can ask the question, why did this happen for me, I suppose, when good things happen. But we're more inclined, of course, to ask, why did this happen to me when bad things happen? Again, that victim mentality. Like somehow or another, everyone is conspiring. Think about the last time you were upset about something that happened at school. And your instincts are to simply ask, why is this teacher doing this to me? Right? We're back, of course, to the removal of training wheels from the back of a bike, and a story that I think I shared with you already, right? In other words, coming to terms with the events as they happen in our life, from the perspective of having the control over those events by virtue of what happens up here in the mind. In other words, Plato will point it out this way. Remember, they killed his teacher. Socrates is poisoned with hemlock, right? So Plato has a very clear understanding of what it means when he uses the term injustice. For Plato, every time the term injustice comes up in his mind, he's going to remember that 399 moment in that prison cell when his teacher, who he adored, drank hemlock, and it was completely wrong. We think, of course, of other moments in history when really important people were treated really badly. They were asked to, for example, maybe climb on crosses or other kinds of instruments of death torture. And we look at it and say, totally inappropriate, totally wrong. So for Plato, he understands injustice, but the question for him is, what are you going to do at that moment? Right? So there is this project of perspicacity, insight, we'll call it wisdom. Another way to think of it, of course, is, back to our earlier lecture, can you put yourself in that moment where you are a few seconds away from flatlining? And then can you ask the question, what matters to me now? Right? Because if you'll think about it, the key to insight is to realize that you cannot live in the past because it's gone. There is no going back. There is no undoing the prior experiences of your life. And the problem with the future is it never happens. You never get there. No matter how much you think about what's coming, you never actually get there. That is to say, it doesn't actually exist. It's a postulate of the mind. The only thing you have any control over is now, this moment. What you do at this moment, for Socrates, for Plato, is all about the questions that you ask. Namely, one question, namely, why is this happening for me? And in the process of maturing, and that doesn't have anything to do for Plato with, being old enough to buy a beer or to vote or whatever. It has far more to do with the capacity to ask a question and answer that question with some kind of intelligence, some kind of wisdom. There's a second kind of understanding, and we'll simply call this the sociological model. That is to say, the group model. And there have been a lot of people who have looked at this word picture of the cave allegory and said, you know what, this is also a very keen insight. Let's talk about this one for a moment. This has to do with freedom for others, not just for self, right? Freedom for others, not just for self. See, because it's altogether possible that now we go back and look at this word picture and we say, what is it like to be an individual who has left the cave, understands that what those people in the cave are looking at are shadows on a wall that aren't real, and then to know you know something they don't know? What is that like? What kind of feelings might one have for those individuals as you look at them and say, oh, they have no clue at all, just like I once had no clue at all? Let's talk about the sociological model. We have to find it fascinating that when we look, for example, at one of the classic stories of injustice, I've mentioned it a couple of times, now let's explicate. That classic story of injustice, by almost all accounts, there's no reason why Jesus Christ should be on a cross for anything that he's done. Right? Yes, he upset a few people, just like Socrates upset a few people. But really? The death of a cross? And yet one of the most fascinating things about the story is that he is purported to have said about the people who did this to him, not the really nasty people, but rather two things which are usually overlooked. The great philosopher St. Augustine didn't overlook it, which is why, of course, we talk about it today now. He says, listen to what he says, Christ, on the cross. Forgive them, which is a compelling idea. The idea of letting it go after somebody has done nasty to you is, of course, a very difficult dilemma. It's a very difficult proposition. Somebody has done nasty, to say forgive them. That's compelling enough. That alone would be remarkable. But the second thing purported that was said was even more remarkable. For they know not what they do. Now that is compelling. Think about what that means. The reason you forgive people is because they're stupid. They're ignorant. Not in any mean or malicious way. Quite literally, they don't know. Don't know what? That shadows on a wall. I'm reminded of a certain young freshman who had learned these concepts in her early years. For reasons I'll not get into, she knew this story. And in her first week in high school, as a freshman, one of the seniors decided to try to put her in her place, as seniors sometimes feel want to do with freshmen. And so this senior said some really nasty things to her. was attacking her linguistically, verbally. And halfway through the attack, talking about whatever it was she was saying to her to make her feel bad, the young freshman just paused and in the most gentle of expressions said, "It's okay. You don't have to attack me. I understand you're afraid. And I understand you don't understand. Don't worry. There will come a day when you will understand. It's all right." Reporting this information later, she said that the senior just kind of backed up away from her and said, What did you just say to me?" "It's all right." She said the louder the individual got, the softer she got. Because people who are chained up, who don't get it, that is their natural inclination. Just scream louder. Just say it harder. Just run into the wall harder and then back up and do it all over again. So she said it a second time. "It's all right. I get it. You're afraid. It's okay. I'm afraid too. I don't understand what you're going through. You're a senior. How could I understand that? But I do know this. It's okay. You just don't get it." Now, here's an interesting insight. What would it mean to qualify injustices done towards you with the simple understanding that the people who are doing those things to you are doing them to you not because they're evil or bad, but rather because they're stupid and ignorant? Let's go ahead and address it now. One of the key philosophic debates in the history of Western speculation is this notion about human nature. Are humans inherently nasty, evil, bad, fallen? All of those terms come to mind. Or are they rather good, but a society has a tendency to corrupt them in some way? Now, the Platonic insight here is key. Plato has every reason to believe that the Athenians who kill his blessed teacher, instructor, Socrates, are